For anyone who likes any popular music up until 98, you must have wondered at one point, how the hell was British music so good? Because historically, British music's not been particularly brilliant. It's not as if we have like the best musical education in the world. We don't have this long history of top tier classical music like Italy, Germany, or France. We don't have all these amazing homegrown genres like blues and jazz like America. You know, this post-war boomer generation of musicians who, in the UK, you know, there's lots of great musicians, right? It's not as if they were brought up in a country that was particularly well off or anything like that. The point is, it doesn't really look like the conditions were there to make brilliant music, right? Sure, compared to France or Germany or other European countries, the fact that we speak English and America speaks English was a huge advantage because, let's be honest, 20th century was the American century, and maybe the 21st century will also be the American century, but maybe not. We'll have to see what happens over the next few years. But it is kind of quite baffling, really, that British music is so disproportionately good, at least up until 1980, and I would say past that, you know, but let's just focus on the period early 60s to 1980-ish. That's when it was really hugely disproportionately good. You know, like, I would say when it comes to pop and rock music, I would say it's better than America, which had a population and has a population around 5 times the size. So the question really is, how the hell is British music so good in that era? There's tons of ways to explain this, like anything in history, but something that I think is really underrated and how much it's talked about is really just quite simply British schools, or at least the British school system during that period. So really what I'm talking about is primarily, though not solely, the grammar school system, which was a big deal back then. So let's just give a bit of context. I'm not going to explain the entire grammar school system, but basically it was, and it still exists a little bit today in the UK, but only in certain places. Grammar schools are much rarer. It was from 1944 up until kind of around like the 80s, a system where essentially there was an 11 plus exam, and kids did this exam, and they were essentially like siphoned off into the smart kids would go to grammar school, and maybe the less smart kids just went to secondary school. So you're essentially skimming off the brightest kids, sending them off to school to get a slightly different, arguably, well, better education, right? There's tons of controversial elements to this about how it kind of leads to stratification of society. Whatever, I'm not going to get into this, but the fact of the matter is loads of bright kids went off to grammar schools. And grammar schools were different in so far as what they taught the kids. It had like a higher standard of education. Quite frankly, they were better schools than standard state schools during this time period. But also they were gender segregated. This will be important later on because I think this thinking about grammar schools and the education of rock musicians in this time period helps us understand a few other things as well. But yeah, so if we just go through a bunch of musicians who went to grammar school, and some of these went to boarding school or private school, which again, you know, that's about high standard education. But we'll go through the grammar school kids bit by bit. And then we'll just kind of talk generally. This is an unscripted video, so hopefully I don't ramble too much. I probably will, but I can edit it down and make myself look amazing and charming and witty. We'll start with The Clash, punk band. This is quite late in this time period that I'm talking about. These are working class punk kids, or so we think, right? They are a bit working class. Grammar school kids quite often were working class, but there's also a bit of boarding school and private school with the members of The Clash. And a bit of grammar school, a bit of art school as well. It's a hell of a mix. It's not just straightforward like working class kids picking up guitar. This is like, these are grammar school well-educated kids. Elton John, grammar school. Sting, grammar school. Mark Knopfler, Robert Fripp. Some members of Queen like Brian May. Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin, obviously. Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull. John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin. Pete Townsend, Mick Jagger, Ian Dury, Supertramp, members from Supertramp went to boarding and private school. Pink Floyd, there's a bit of art school in there and a bit of grammar school in there. Some people from the Stranglers, again, we're talking about a punk band here, Stranglers, and Paul McCartney, right? So one of the members of the Beatles went to grammar school as well. This is quite a wide range of musicians, right? And these are most of the big heavy hitters of this kind of British generation of rock musicians and pop musicians. I want to point out about these. Some of these are my favorite musicians, or were in some of my favorite bands, or created some of my favorite albums of all time, right? But it is worth pointing out that in actual fact, in spite of this video being asking how was British music so good, and in spite of the fact that some of these musicians are amongst my favorite musicians ever, in actual fact, they're kind of not that good as musicians. None of these guys, none of them are actually top tier, like world-class musicians on their instrument or in their like specific class. They're not, none of them are like Keith Jarrett kind of tier, or Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, Pat Metheny, Bela Fleck, George Benson, Stanley Clarke, Billy Cobham, Stevie Wonder. None of these British musicians can really go toe to toe in terms of like sheer musical skill, knowledge, competency against their peers from over in America, right? They're not virtuosic in the same way. They don't have the wide musical vocabulary or skill that they do. They're still made music that is just as good, and personally maybe quite often better, but quite different than those high school musicians. So like what the hell is going on? Like the problem I'm trying to solve here, I'm trying to think through here, isn't just, hey, British music was really good during this time period, but it was also really good in a specific way. And all of these guys, the British kind of cohort of really good boomer, post-war generation musicians, some of them are certainly quite technically competent. You know, Elton John, Keith Emerson, I guess, Rick Wakeman. But even those guys, they're still not that absolute top tier. What they really had on their side was a more generalist approach. Some of them are fantastic, not just really good musicians, but they're also really good lyricists. They've got like this kind of bigger artistic vision of telling stories and like wit, satire, parody, observational skills. Like when it comes to people, they know how to write characters. They rap all their music, you know, whether it's Mark Knopfler, Sting, Elton John's not a lyricist, but him and Bernie Taupin, Paul McCartney, all these guys, right? They know how to wrap their music up in not just like competency and like, oh, it's a good melody, or I'm rhythmically sophisticated, or whatever it might be when it comes to just sheer musical ability to play one's instrument, right? They can wrap their music in storytelling and history and irony while still being good, maybe even great, but not absolutely top tier musicians. So they do exist, but it's much rarer in the UK. The UK, the British, English really in a way, we're kind of primarily talking, grammar school education produced a different type of brilliant musician to just like what you would see in classical music or jazz music, where it's someone getting super hyper competent at improvisational skills, musicianship, technical ability, blah blah blah. It's more about like creating art as a whole. And just to be clear, I'm not saying American musicians can't do this. America, just, you know, the economic powerhouse of the 20th century, huge population and, you know, good education, and like it is the center point of 20th century culture across the world, obviously produced loads of musicians like this as well. The point is really that the UK was more like specialized in that generalist kind of world and was hitting well above its weight, like way above, like outclassing itself basically. It's crazy. That's grammar school. Then when it comes to art school, the list gets even longer when we include that as well, because that's Eric Clapton now. We're talking Ron Wood, Keith Richards, Jeff Beck, Christine McVie, Cat Stevens, Brian Ferry, David Bowie, did I say him already? Loads of these guys, right? Some of them went to grammar school and art school. John Lennon as well, actually. John Lennon. It's quite different to just the education specifically in music that a lot of these kind of, I don't know, Pat Metheny or Keith Jarrett would have been getting as like, you know, an immediate career in the world of jazz. You know, they live and breathe music in a way that all these people I have named from the UK just never really did. That's obviously why they didn't end up as technically brilliant. Like if you want to end up like Pat Metheny or Bela Fleck, like you live your instrument, you live the music. And the reality is like, it doesn't matter whether it's Paul McCartney or Freddie Mercury or like, I can't think of a single real like big British rock star, for whom I would say that, where they lived music and they were just obsessed with it. They had all these other interests that they brought into their music. Got more thoughts to share. Let me just check my notes and we'll kind of go through them bit by bit. To remember that grammar schools were specifically set up from 1944, the Butler Act, to help increase and maintain social mobility. So a lot of these musicians I've mentioned obviously went on to be phenomenally wealthy, and it's weird to think of them as working class now, Sting, Mark Knopfler, but they did, a lot of them grow up working class. And again, the UK was very poor at the time, rationing and just post-war economic malaise. And these working class kids, they were bright, that's why they went to grammar school, right? And they were ambitious. You combine this class-conscious, very ambitious attitude with genuinely very bright kids who are good at music, and you get this unique historical period where people who want to be rock stars and are not ashamed to say it. They didn't necessarily think, I want to be a rock star. There was no such thing as a rock star at the time, but they wanted to be rich and famous. They weren't ashamed to sing about it at times, right? Baby, you can drive my car. Yes, I'm gonna be and they wanted to do well, and they had a generalist interest, not just in music. They're not just Keith Jarrett, just playing piano, right? I'm not trying to offend him. I'm sure he has other interests outside of music, but it's really music about music, and it's quite different to, I don't know, a Beatles song, which is by definition, has all these lyrics going on and has all these other connections to other elements in culture, and maybe you could describe it as tragic or comic or whatever, all these different things that we can think about that most jazz isn't really doing in the same way. Yeah, and a lot of it comes just down to this kind of like working class conscious, bright kids who are also very ambitious. Kind of seems obvious in a way, doesn't it? And obviously that connection with America is super important because they grew up listening to American music, and American music to them was aspirational, right? They wanted to be like, whether that's Elvis or some of the old blues classics that they liked, or Chuck Berry, could be any of these musicians. It was aspirational. America was wealth, America was glitz and glam, and it was blues music. It was exciting, it was different. It wasn't this kind of post-war drudgery and rationing. So yeah, a lot of it comes down to specifically aspiration and ambition. So I hinted earlier at some other things, or maybe just one thing that it can help explain, and it was to do with gender, right? These schools were gender segregated. So the boys went off to one grammar school and the girls went off to another grammar school. Normal secondary schools at the time were not gender segregated. Some of them, I guess, would have been, but for the most part, they weren't. And if you look at British music of this period, by the end of it, like the late 70s is quite different, but for most of it, it's very much a boys' club. Very, very much a boys' club, and far more so than American music at the time. In America, we've got Cynthia Weil, we've got Aretha Franklin, Carole King, Laura Nyro, Joan Baez, Hart. Going further back, Ella Fitzgerald. In the UK, who do we have? By the end of the time period, late 70s onwards, we get more, but up until then, even, we're really only talking about, like, especially when we're talking about big names, like, there's Kate Bush, there's Christine McVie, tell me sweet little lies. And then one that comes to my mind, not very famous at all, is Betty Thatcher, who's the lyricist for the band Renaissance. It's worth noting here, by the way, that both Betty Thatcher and Kate Bush were grammar school kids, and Christine McVie was art school, right? So the UK was way more of a boys' club, just way more. And I think, obviously, girls did go to grammar school. I have no idea, like, if more boys went than girls. But that's not necessarily the point. The point is that if you gender segregate them, loads of things are boys' clubs, let's be honest. Like, loads of society is still to this day quite sexist, right? But if you segregate them by gender to such a degree, it's kind of like network effects. Like, the boys all know each other, they hang out, they form bands together. The girls had way less opportunity to do that, even though obviously they were going to be just as bright and just as good at music, right? But they weren't hanging out with tons of their peers who were picking up rock guitars and playing. So the boys went off in their own little world and started playing. And you ended up with this kind of British pop and rock scene that up until the late 70s was so much of a boys' club, way more of a boys' club than America. Because some of the most successful songwriters of that period in America were women. Again, Cynthia Weil, and she was writing with Barry Mann. They wrote loads of super successful songs. Aretha Franklin, obviously huge. Carole King, one of the biggest albums of the 70s. Joan Baez, like hugely important from 1960 onwards, right? It's totally different in the UK. I don't think that's the only way of explaining this big gender disparity, but I think it must have had a huge impact. I think it helps explain, this is one more thing that I do think it helps explain, why rock musicians don't really get better as they get older. When I grew up, I kind of, looking at the musicians I loved, I thought it was like an inevitable thing that musicians kind of peak. I don't know, let's say up until their mid-30s onwards. Even that seems sometimes a little bit too generous. And then it's like a steady decline. But as you grow older and you listen to more like jazz and classical, you realize that some classical musicians, most probably, just keep getting better, right? Beethoven's best was, in his later years. Same with Bach, or I mean, Mozart died young. But like the big name, loads of big names, they just keep making great music. Same in jazz, right? Potentially, some jazz musicians die young, obviously. Some burn out, but loads of them just keep getting better. They keep getting more technically competent, like more knowledgeable about how music works and how to compose and working with other people. So why is it rock musicians don't? Some of it is the lifestyle, like they fizzle out and die young or get addicted to drugs. But that's true of jazz musicians as well, and it's definitely true of some classical musicians. I think it's because rock musicians end up, because it's not a genre of excellence in the same way that in a way that classical music and jazz music are. Like with jazz, it's a genre of excellence, right? And classical certainly, partly because these are academic genres now, but it's always been the case that like jazz and classical, like it's about being brilliant. At the end of the day, like you can keep just working on it. It's not like a generalist skill. Most classical composers, all classical composers, maybe except for Wagner, just didn't write lyrics. Like they would take someone else's libretto and they would put it to music. So they don't have that skill set. They're composers. Not saying that they can't take things from other elements of life. They 100% did. They've had the influence of their religion or philosophical or political beliefs or whatever, but not in the same way that like a songwriter does, because they're writing those lyrics, right? And there's other generalist skills in there. So I reckon like a lot of rock musicians don't continue to get better with age because they don't continue to have that a development of generalist skills. Rock stardom is probably really bad for everyone involved. Like social inequalities, not great. It seems really great to be a rock star. I mean, we all know the pitfalls and drugs and fame and how that can have a negative impact on people. But I think it has an inherently negative impact upon their art, because as you grow rich and famous, you kind of inevitably, all of them inevitably cut themselves out of just normal day-to-day life amongst normal people. And being connected to that in the first place was the strength of their art, right? The fact that Paul McCartney was writing songs about just normal people. Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding. From the very beginning, right? And punk writers or whoever it is, they're writing songs that connect to like everyday life in so many ways, or things in history, whatever. Now, I'm rambling here, but hopefully I'll edit it down to make more sense. I do think those musicians who had the longest careers and the longest kind of periods of high quality music production are those who just maintained an interest in things outside of being a rock star and being rich, right? So Paul McCartney had his family, went to live on a farm in Scotland, and those things clearly impacted music in a good way and gave him kind of more material to work with and turn it into something else. But you'll notice he doesn't really get better as a musician from like 1970 onwards, really, like maybe in some very slight ways, but his musical development peaks by the time he's left the Beatles. He doesn't get any more amazing at piano. He doesn't become a better bass player or a better singer. He's already as good as he needs to be. Mark Knopfler, obviously clearly interested in loads of things in American history. We are sailing to Philadelphia. History generally and social issues and things like that. These things impact his art, and he clearly maintained that interest. Someone like David Bowie, I think, maintained a pretty high quality career throughout most of his life. The exceptions usually are those people who either knew how to bring in new people with different skill sets, like David Bowie, who was always working with someone different and he's kind of keeping things fresh that way, or people who maintain an academic interest in broader subjects. I think Mark Knopfler kind of fits there a little bit. Or just, their life is changing and they can use that in interesting ways. I think Paul McCartney did that a bit, although to be quite frank, I think there's very little worth listening to from Paul McCartney from like 1980 onwards. I know a lot of people disagree with that, but does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. I really do think Elton John's like a classic example. I think Elton John's music up until like, I don't know, 76 or 77 is stellar, like really good. But then he just becomes like a rock star, and it just becomes this kind of rock stardom for the sake of being a rock star thing, where he's just churning out albums that are like quite often very competent, quite often not particularly, but he lost that spark, and maybe some of it's to do with like cocaine addiction, right? He seems to have peaked by it. He seems to have peaked earlier than that, really, and then it's this sea of like mediocrity with the odd like classic tune, but it's quite rare, and it's because he's just ensconced in this world of rock stardom, and he didn't seem to have maintained much of an interest in history or books or reading. It could be anything, right? And he's certainly not just living with normal people and like going down to the pub and meeting like weird characters in that way. And if your art is built off of this kind of generalist experience of the world, then it will suffer when that's all cut off and you're not living it anymore. And he didn't get Elton John, still on the subject of Elton John, he didn't get any more technically competent. Like he could have like been like, well, I'm going to sit down and still practice 5 hours a day and really get better. Maybe I'll practice this or that. Maybe I'll push into jazz or classical a bit more and use those skills. Rock musicians tend not to do that. They get to a level of technical competency and they just kind of flatline for a bit. Which again is fine if you maintain this wider interest in things that you can bring into your art, but so many don't. I think it explains that a bit. Anyway, let's now talk about songs from this generation of musicians that explicitly talk about school. Some of these songs are not by grammar school educated kids, some of them are. But we've got loads. And the British experience of school seems to be quite different from the American one. Like School's Out by Alice Cooper. Americans just seem to be far less mopey about what school is. And I think, especially for the grammar school kids in the UK, a lot of it is just like culture shock. Like they're suddenly around like kids from different backgrounds quite often. Even if they're on a scholarship to like a private school, or if they're just at grammar school, they might be now hanging out with like middle class kids. So you got working class, middle class, maybe some quite posh kids, and it's all culture shock. It's very different. Like they're suddenly learning things. It's almost like a cultural break with their parents quite often, because they're thrown into this middle class world and they're brought up working class. So British rock music seems to quite often be expressing loads of anxieties and weird negative attitudes towards schooling. So we've got obviously Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd. Even some songs like Getting Better by the Beatles only really mention it briefly, but I think it's important still. I used to get mad at my school. The teachers had taught me when Ichiku Park by the Small Faces. Supertramp, it's a theme they keep coming back to. We've got Logical Song, we've got School, and we've got Bloody Well Right. Then they sent me away, teach me how to be sensible. Don't forget your books, you know you've got to learn the golden rule. So you think your schooling's funny. And Jethro Tull, it's kind of a running theme throughout Aqualung, but mainly Wind Up. When I was young, and they packed me off to school. American attitudes towards school feel quite different, nowhere near as negative. So, like, the Beach Boys have a few songs about school, but they're much more like, I'm proud of my school, I'm going to be true to my school, and my school's the best. Much more like a kind of cheerleady kind of school spirit attitude, which is very alien to us Brits, right? I Wish by Stevie Wonder. Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard. See me and Julio down by the schoolyard. All these songs are quite different. They're much more positive, much less miserable than the British stuff. So I want to wrap up now by just looking at a little contrast between Roger Waters' attitude towards school from Pink Floyd and Suggs from Madness, his attitude towards school. They're quite different. They went to different schools, right? Suggs recalled in an interview, I was very specifically trying to write a song in the style of Ian Dury, and here he's talking about Baggy Trousers, by the way. Naughty boys in nasty schools, headmasters breaking all the rules, having fun and playing. So especially in the songs he was writing then, which were often catalogues of phrases in a constant stream. He contrasted, this is Suggs, baggy trousers with Pink Floyd's 1979 single, Another Brick in the Wall. Suggs goes on to say, I was writing about my time at school. Pink Floyd had that big hit with Teacher, Leave Those Kids Alone. It didn't really relate to me because I hadn't been to a public school where I was bossed about and told to sing Rule Britannia and all that, having instead attended a comprehensive school with much less strictly enforced discipline. So, I mean, from the horse's mouth, right? Like a contemporary boomer musician from the 70s telling us that school, was a big deal, and the difference between the grammar school kids and the working class, well, grammar school kids could be working class, right? But the grammar school kids and the comprehensive school kids, it's a theme, right? There was a bit of a stratification in society, and this is kind of what I hinted at earlier with like the controversial elements of grammar school. A lot of people think they're really great for a lot of reasons. A lot of people don't like them. I'm not going to get into that, right? But it clearly had a huge impact on British pop and rock musicians and the music they made from the 60s till, I guess, mid-80s, maybe even into the 90s. Yeah, cool. That's me, really. Hopefully, you found that interesting. I think it's quite an interesting topic. This is just kind of an exploration of it. If there's anything obvious I missed out, leave it in the comments below. If you totally disagree and you think I missed the mark on it, feel free to disagree. Also, I'll see you around.